This presentation is called From Pizarro's Boulevard to Bruce's Haldenblatt's Viennese Actionism Against the Myth of Innocence. What I'm tracing here is a line from 19th century Paris to post-war Vienna, not because they're the same, but because they developed similar strategies for dealing with official lies. On one end, there's Pizarro quietly repainting modern life just off the Salon's radar. On the other, there are Viennese actionists dragging blood, bodies, and entrails into a country that has convinced itself that it was merely the first victim. The question running underneath all of this is simple. What does art do when the dominant story about a nation is not just incomplete but actively dishonest? Austria's post-war self-image is built on a very convenient sentence. In 1943, the Allies announced that Austria was the first free country to fall victim to Hitlerite aggression, and after 1945, that line hardened into the so-called first victim theory. Under that banner, Austrians could imagine themselves as occupied and misled, the people things were done to rather than the people doing them. Carly Good shows how this victim's mantle helped former Nazis re-enter public life and let the state mourn its bomb damage without talking too much about deportations or complicity. The visual record is less sentimental. Photographs of huge crowds cheering Hitler in Vienna, party rolls full of Austrian names, and officials who seem remarkably comfortable in both the Third Reich and the Second Republic all sit uneasily under the word victim. The gap between the photographs and the story is the pressure point that later artists will keep prodding. This is what the first victim supposedly looks like, a sea of bodies pressed together in Haldenplatz cheering Hitler. The swastika banners on the gate make it impossible to pretend that Austria just woke up one day occupied. The photograph quietly shreds the comforting story that the post-war republic tells about itself. So the country insists on being read as a victim. At the same time, its historical body remembers something closer to enthusiasm. The result is a split, a surface narrative of innocence stretched over muscles that recall collaboration and consent. This is where Viennese actionism lives. It is less interested in producing polite objects for the wall and more interested in shoving fingers directly into that wound. This movement treats Austria not as an abstract nation, but as a damaged body that has been badly bandaged and told to smile. Its actions are what happen when the bandage starts to itch and someone finally scratches. In that sense, the violence of the performances is not gratuitous, it is diagnostic. Museum labels call Viennese actionism a radical performance movement that expanded paintings into actions and used body as the material. All of that is true, and also extremely euphemistic. In practice, actionists cut, smeared, bound, and exposed bodies, often their own, in events that hovered somewhere between ritual and crime. Carolyn Glamboska emphasizes how short, violent, and deeply physical these performances were, full of animal blood, entrails, and bodily fluids. The point was not shock for its own sake, but to force a confrontation with everything that the clean-up, Catholic, conservative surface of Austrian life preferred to keep out of sight. If the country insists that its conscience was spotless, the actionists merely responded by staining the most visible surfaces they had access to, their own skin, the flag, the anthem, the university hall. It is a sort of visual sabotage aimed not at individual viewers, but at national self-image. Magdalena Pollock argues that you cannot argue Viennese actionism at all unless you put it back inside the first victim myth. This myth sits very awkwardly beside the photographs of Viennese crowds greeting Hitler with great joy and alongside the reality that denazification in Austria was far less thorough than in West Germany. Many former party members quietly reappeared as civil servants as politicians. The Catholic Church reoccupied its familiar moral high ground without fully grappling with its wartime compromises. The result, in Pollock's term, is a deeply conservative Catholic society that refuses to acknowledge its own responsibility. In that context, the actionists are not just eccentric performance artists, they are conducting a counter-liturgy, where the official rituals purify and forget, the actionists contaminate and remember. They stage in public the dirt that the victim myth works so hard to keep off of the national body. It is blasphemy in the precise sense of speaking against something that itself has been declared sacred. Church in 1938 matters because it shows how stable, trusted institutions stayed in place while everything in Austria was being renegotiated. The same bells that marked baptisms and weddings also marked the years of dictatorship, giving a sense of normalcy to something that was anything but. It's a reminder that the built landscape and its moral authority didn't vanish. They quietly adapted, helping everyday life feel continuous even as the political order was being rewritten. After Bruce's Vienna walk makes the critique almost diagrammatic. In 1965, he walks through the center of Vienna with his clothes and his skin painted white and a single black line splitting him in half from head to toe. Glambowska calls him a living painting, but he also reads perfectly as a walking wound. In a city that likes to see itself in pastel postcards and imperial facades, Bruce inserts a body that looks like a scar moving across the surface. The black line can be read as an incision down a whitewashed history, a reminder that the narrative of innocence is a very visible crack. Ordinary pedestrians, who did not sign up for avant-garde theater, suddenly have to share their everyday space with this divided figure. The same streets that once staged mass enthusiasm for Hitler now have to accommodate a solitary man who is visibly split. It is a quiet but relentless demand that the city notice its own fracture. Bruce himself turns into a walking fault line, a white fragile body split in half by a single black scar down the middle. The fact that he's next to a policeman makes it feel like the state is literally escorting its own repressed history down the street. Everyday Vienna becomes a stage where the myth of innocence has to brush past what it refuses to see. Herman Nitsch takes the same historical pressure and shifts it onto the altar. His Orgian Mysterian theater mixes processions, slaughtered animals, blood, wine, and Christian symbology in large-scale actions that last for hours or days. In his manifestos, Nish insists that these are cathartic rites, designed to make participants confront cruelty, sexuality, and death instead of hiding them behind sanitized liturgy. Glambowska points out how his white vestments, soaked in blood and then displayed like relics, invert Catholic visual language. Where the church uses white fabric to signify purity, washing away sin, Nish lets the saints sit there and demand to be acknowledged. In a country that moved from the 1930s into post-war respectability with remarkably little moral interruption, these actions function as accusation in ritual form. They imply that redemption without memory is just performance and not the good kind. This looks like a Catholic procession that has been turned inside out. The white robe, cruciform pose, the carcasses, everything that is usually sanitized and symbolic is suddenly wet, heavy, and impossible to spiritualize away. Nish is forcing a country that loves ritual to look at what it usually keeps off stage. Here the performance is dried into painting but still reads like a crime scene. The red drips echo both altarpieces and slaughterhouse walls, so if you can't tell if you're in a chapel or an abattoir, it's a reminder that even when bodies are gone, the surfaces keep the stain. Mule and Rolf Schwarzkogger work on the same myth from different corners of everyday life. Mule's material actions pile up everyday household objects and bodies into collapsing heaps as if the violence of public history is seeped into the kitchen and living room. Schwarzkogger's carefully staged photographs show bandaged limbs, surgical tape, eggs, and scalpels arranged with clinical precision. It's never quite clear whether the figure is being treated or experimented on, healed or damaged. Pollock reads this as a society that has turned its real wounds into medical abstractions, cases to be managed rather than histories to be owned. If Bruce embodies the split between civic body and Nitsch plays the obscene priest, then Mule and Schwarzkogger haunt the domestic and clinical spaces where people are supposed to be cared for. Their work suggests that even those spaces are contaminated by the refusal to speak honestly about the past. On the left, Schwarzkogger turns the body into something clinical and almost inert, bandaged, taped, and studded with fish like a medical specimen. On the right, Mule explodes the domestic space into chaos. Food, limbs, trash, everything mixed together. One image in the body is the case file, the other as garbage. Both are versions of how society can learn to stop seeing a person as a person. Confrontation between Actionism and Austrian respectability comes to a head in 1968 with the Art and Revolution event at the University of Vienna. During an academic setting that was supposed to be safely contained, the actionists performed a sequence of transgressions: self-laceration, public urination, masturbation, and the defilement of the Austrian flag while singing the national anthem. For this, Bruce is charged with offending public morals and besmirching Austrian symbols, sentenced to prison, and ultimately pushed into exile. The hierarchy of what is being protected here is revealing. A human body can apparently be cut or humiliated, and the system will cope. What cannot be tolerated is the direct contamination of official symbols of the nation. The myth can absorb a ruined individual. It cannot bear to watch his flag and anthem literally dragged through the substances it pretends do not exist. This is a university classroom, but it looks like a public dissection. While one man speaks calmly into a microphone, another is beating a naked body in front of a blackboard full of diagrams. The clash between academic order and physical humiliation shows exactly why the state panicked. The art has brought violence, usually kept in abstract lecture halls, back into the actual human body. Tempting to describe all of this as artists trying to simply shock the bourgeois. This is usual dismissal. If we pull back, a longer pattern appears. An institution insists on a particular image of reality. Time and history make that image ring as false, and artists in different centuries start recognizing the relationship between art, the body, and the audience to force another truth into view. Camille Pissarro does this quietly against the Paris Salon. Antonin Artaud does it on the stage, rewriting what theater is supposed to feel like. The Viennese Actionists do it, less quietly, in a post-Nazi Catholic democracy. The specifics differ, but the structural move is the same. When official images stop matching lived reality, artists stop playing along. Pizarro's revolt looks modest aside blood and entrails, but it follows the same logic. In 1874, he and his peers organized the first Impressionist exhibition as a cooperative in Nadar's studio rather than submitting to the state-sanctioned Salon. Paris at this point is still recovering from the Franco-Prussian War and the Commune. The Salon prefers large, polished canvases that replay reassuring histories and myths. Outside of the exhibition halls, the real city is full of smoke, industry, and unrest. Pissarro, the oldest member of the group and the only one to exhibit all 8 Impressionist shows, insists on painting ordinary rural and urban scenes and plein air in specific weather and light. Frost on a field, factory haze over a river, traffic on a boulevard become legitimate subjects, showing that work outside the Salon's control is a small act of institutional disobedience. It quietly asserts that the reality of mud, labor, and atmosphere deserve to be seen, even if it does not flatter the nation. Pissarro is not painting emperors or battles. He's painting a person walking across a field, across a cold, scraped field. The light is unstable, the ground is uneven, and the modern life looks small and provisional. It's a quiet rejection of the heroic national image in favor of how it actually feels to live in a landscape being worked on and worn down. Above, the boulevard is just traffic, pedestrian smoke, and the weather. No central monument, no heroic subject. Pissarro shows off Paris as a system of flows instead of a stage for great men. That shift is a viewpoint for its own kind of soft actionism. The city is no longer a myth, it's infrastructure. Antonin Artaud pushes the critique from the gallery into the nervous system. In The Theater and Its Double, he calls for a theater of cruelty that abandons polite conversational drama in favor of assaultive mixtures of sound, light, and movement and gesture. For Artaud, cruelty is not simple sadism. It's a merciless commitment to confronting truth and stripping away the social masks that keep people comfortable. He famously compares this theater to a plague that spreads through a community, disorganizes its habits, and forces it to face what it has been repressing. Directors influenced by him, like Jerzy Kotowski and Peter Brook, work with bare stages, ritualized actions, and the actors' bare bodies as primary instruments. The body becomes both the site and the weapon of critique. The language of physical shock and ritual is exactly the vocabulary that the Viennese actionist later speaks, just in a different historic key. An aficionado of carbon tetrachloride, Artaud looks like somebody who has already been through the plague he's writing about. The gaze is intense but not triumphant. It's haunted. This is what the theorist is saying that theater should feel like. An epidemic in the body, not a polite evening out. And the actionist will basically take that instruction literally. Seen from this angle, Bruce and Nietzsche are not anomalies but logical errors. When Bruce says, in effect, my body is the event, he's doing Artaud's plague on a post-Nazi street. Nietzsche's Orgian mystic theater acts like a perverse group therapy session, and not the kind that reassures, but the kind that tears away illusions and makes everybody sit with what they would rather avoid. Pissarro's cooperative exhibition refuses the Salon's monopoly on what counts as reality. Artaud refuses theater as safe bourgeois entertainment. The actionists refuse the idea that Austria can be both innocent and unexamined. All 3 cases reject art as the distant object meant to be admired from a clean seat. They admit that at certain moments, the only honest option is to let art happen to people, bodily and uncomfortably. At the time that Mumak mounts the My Body is the Event, the art world is largely accepted that works by Bruce, Nietzsche, Mule, and Schwarzkogger belong in the same genealogy as Marina Abramovic, Chris Burden, and Yoko Ono. The exhibition argues that Viennese actionism is central to the shift from static objects to body and performance art. Daily art noticed that the actionists treat the human body like an action painting, scripted in advance, executed in real time with real physical risk. In this context, shot value is not a cheap trick, it's the medium itself and the way the work registers on the audience. These performances are not illustrations of ideas about guilt, denial, or violence, they're situations in which those dynamics are enacted visibly and viscerally. The art is not the documentation, the art is the event that the documentation is struggling to keep up with. The same kind of actions live in a pristine white cube, projected on clean walls with headphones neatly hanging down. What was once scandal and police intervention has become art history, something you can quietly consume in a museum. The question underneath this slide is whether these images still have teeth or whether the institution has fully house-trained them. Official stories tend to be flattering. Austria as victim, France as a civilized heir of Rome, and culture as an orderly line of masterpieces in gold frames. Underneath, the record is messier. Cheering crowds on Haldenplatz, factory smoke on Pizarro's horizon, and the cruelty that Artaud insists is woven into everyday life. Pissarro answers the gap by painting hoarfrost, mud, and workers, and by showing those canvases where the salon cannot filter them. Artaud designs a theater that makes the audience's social mask slip. Bruce, Nietzsche, Mule, and Schwarzkogger drab the abject body into spaces consecrated to cleanliness and respect. In each case, the goal is to not make reality more pleasant, it's to make it harder for the myth to pretend that it's alone on the stage. When a status quo lies long enough, someone finally eventually replies in another language. Trembling brushstrokes on a boulevard, a man split in half with paint, and an altar that refuses to stay white.